Hello again. My name is Frank Altamar, and welcome to part 2 of our treatise Infrastructural Psychosis, How Social Media is Rewiring the Brain and What You Can Do About It. So in the last episode, we focused a lot on the biological architecture of infrastructural psychosis, mainly the mechanisms in the areas of the brain that are responsible for processing emotion and logical processing versus emotional processing, and kind of showing how social media algorithms and technology, in essence, manipulates and mediates these structures and kind of forces the brain into a low attention state where it can essentially be used to force more engagement in social media and more use of the screen, which in essence, as we identified in the Facebook papers and the Facebook social contagion experiment, actually generates more profit for these platforms. And obviously, corporations and businesses in the quest for profit are known to do some unethical and immoral things. And having this knowledge, being public knowledge, you would imagine that these companies will utilize this knowledge to generate more profit for their companies, right? So in the first episode, we went over the biological architecture of the brain, as well as how social media algorithms themselves manipulate it. But we're going to continue the treatise by moving on to episode 2, which is titled Sensor Saturation and Mediated Hypnosis, How Screen Technology Drains Executive Function. And in essence, this episode is going to focus more on the technology itself, right? So it's not necessarily participating in social media in a vacuum. You have to use a screen, a phone, a tablet, a laptop, a computer in order to interact digitally with forms of digital communication such as social media, right? So same as with the last episode, I'm going to go through the slides, read them, provide narration, and possibly expound on these points with some asides as we go through the presentation itself. Okay, so episode 2, Sensor Saturation and Mediated Hypnosis, How Screen Technology Drains Executive Function. All right, so sensor saturation and the HPA axis. So borrowing the analogy of the CEO and the security guard from the previous episode, a key tenet of infrastructural psychosis is essentially bypassing the CEO as primary decision maker, that's the prefrontal cortex, and handing control over to the head of security, represented by the amygdala. Social media companies know that they cannot reason with the CEO, right? The logical processing parts of the brain are simply too critical, too thoughtful, and too slow to monetize. And so they develop their algorithm with the aim of exhausting it. So by flooding the user's feed with high arousal negative content, the technology forces the body into a state of continuous emergency processing, which is mediated by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, also known as the HPA axis. So, phase 1, the lure, targeting the salience network. The algorithm identifies a piece of content that is high arousal. It triggers shock, moral disgust, or intense in-group pride, and it filters it into your feed. The neurochemical hit. The moment you see it, your brain's salience network flags it as critically important. And the exploit. The technology bypasses your CEO's "is this relevant to my actual life" filter and goes straight to the locus coeruleus, which floods your system with norepinephrine, alertness and stress, basically. Phase 2, the drain. Now that you're hooked, you start engaging with the post, liking, disliking, reading or adding comments, sharing and promoting, or conversely, brigading the post in favor of your own in-group, out-group orientation. The action. You are now in a perceived stress state. Every time you craft a witty retort or feel a surge of moral superiority, the hypothalamus is releasing corticotropin-releasing hormone, CRH, triggering the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, into your bloodstream where it travels to the adrenal cortex, signaling cells to convert cholesterol into cortisol. So the context. In a real-world instance of stress or anxiety, such as a physical altercation, the stress of anxiety will gradually subside and the body will return to a state of homeostasis. However, online, the fight never ends. This keeps your HPA axis stuck in the on position, constantly pumping cortisol from the adrenal glands to reflect the state of constant hyperarousal. Phase 3, the brownout. So after 30 minutes or so of this, your prefrontal cortex starts to fatigue. You are now in a state of cognitive ego depletion. The state, you feel fried and irritable. You lose the ability to see nuance. The exploit. This is the end goal of infrastructural psychosis. A drained user is a predictable user. You are now 5 times more likely to click on the next bit of outrage bait because your brain is too tired to be logical and just wired enough to stay engaged. Your head of security is now taken over as the CEO, driving the majority of your decisions throughout the day until the body and brain are at rest. Phase 4, tribal synchronization. Because everyone in your in-group is likely experiencing the same drain simultaneously, the whole community enters into a collective psychosis. The result? The group begins to act as a single reactive organism. Anyone who suggests maybe we should wait for more context, which would be a prefrontal cortex heavy task, is attacked defensively by the security guards of the rest of the tribe for attempting to reactivate a starved system. After all, the role of the head of security is to defend against perceived threats and to eliminate contradictions, cognitive dissonance. The harvest. The platform sees a massive spike in data, ad impressions, and engagement. The social media parasite has fed, and the community is left metabolically exhausted and more polarized than before. Sensor saturation and the norepinephrine trap. When the algorithm shows you something outrageous, it triggers the locus coeruleus in the brainstem. This floods the brain with norepinephrine, which is a stress chemical. The biology: high levels of norepinephrine narrow your focus. You lose global thinking, like perspective, and move into local thinking, attacking and defend, right? Personal preservation. The result: the hypersocial environment is in a constant state of neurochemical tunnel vision, a prolonged mental state that prevents you from being able to see the big picture. The dopamine drip and the cortisol crash. Now, trapped inside this negative feedback loop, your brain looks for a way to solve for the existing threat. It stimulates tiny spikes in the neurotransmitter dopamine, known for reward and motivation, to drive you back into the algorithm, seeking respite for your feelings of stress and anxiety. The drip of dopamine. You get a notification or a like, and a tiny hit of reward provides a momentary relief from the stress. The crash of cortisol. The hit fades almost instantly, leaving a deficit. This creates an additional feedback loop of search and seeking behavior that is the primary driver of addiction. The negative feedback loop. This cycle is what keeps you scrolling. The drip of dopamine never quite fills the deficit left by the steady release of cortisol, and so you continue the behavior in a never-ending feedback loop, hoping for just another little jolt of positive emotion to make it seem like a worthwhile endeavor, right? So it's a confusion amongst the regular community as to what dopamine actually does. A lot of people think of dopamine as the pleasure hormone or the pleasure chemical, when in reality dopamine is the chemical that gets released to prompt you to seek out pleasure, right? So in the case of, say, like a heroin addict, a lot of anecdotes from heroin addicts will explain that it's not the heroin that gives them the most pleasure, but it's approaching the act of having the heroin, engaging in it. So getting the needle ready, prepping their arm, etc. Right? It's the expectation of pleasure that is what causes the body to release dopamine. It engages you to seek out pleasure rather than actually get pleasure from an activity. Right? So again, this idea of seeking reward, right, to provide like small drips of dopamine over a long period of time is kind of like dangling a carrot in front of you to show you like there's the potential for reward. It's designed to get you to seek out the reward, right? But when you have a variable algorithm, the idea is that you don't get pleasure every time you seek out pleasure, right? Which causes a feedback loop, which we're going to get into. The circadian hack, the blue light lock. Your brain has a master clock called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. It is programmed to respond to the blue light frequency of the morning sun, which tells the body to suppress melatonin and release cortisol to start your day. The exploit. Screens, like those on your phone, tablet, laptop, or computer monitor, emit light in the 450 to 490 nanometer range, the exact frequency that signals high noon to your brain, the point in which the sun is at its highest point in the sky, producing the most daylight. The result: when you look at a screen at 11 p.m., you aren't just looking at data, you are optically gaslighting your brain. Your SCN tells the rest of your body that it is midday and melatonin production is delayed or halted altogether while cortisol continues to be produced. At this point, your body's internal clock does not match the reality of the rising and setting sun. The recovery crisis. The prefrontal cortex recovers through two main mechanisms: mindful or breathing-based meditation practice and the restorative stages of deep sleep. During sleep, the brain's glymphatic system literally flushes out metabolic waste, like adenosine, that builds up during the day, releasing it into the bloodstream to be filtered by the liver and kidneys before finally being excreted through your urine and stool. The light lock. By suppressing melatonin and overproducing cortisol, the screen prevents you from entering the restorative stages of sleep. The result? Your PFC starts the next day pre-exhausted. You wake up with what we call brain fog, but what in reality can be defined as sleep debt. This makes you 10 times more susceptible to the infrastructural psychosis the moment you pick up your phone in the morning, locking you into a perpetual cycle of screen and social media addiction. Intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, or IPRGCs. These are the specific cells in the eye that detect blue light and bypass the seeing part of the brain, the visual cortex, to talk directly to the clock part of the brain, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. These cells help regulate an ancient evolutionary reflex called the tonic orienting response. High-intensity light and flickering movement, like that of an infinite scroll, trigger a reflex to lock on to the source of the stimulus. The exploit. Your eyes are physically drawn to the high-contrast blue light and flicker of the refresh rate of your screen. The feedback loop. The blue light keeps you awake and in the low-functioning engagement of the limbic system. The siphoning of glucose from your rational brain keeps the prefrontal cortex weak. The amygdala takes over, and it defensively releases cortisol and seeks the dopamine drips of the algorithm, prompting you to stay engaged longer. So, the slot machine of the mind, pull to refresh. The pull to refresh mechanic was designed by engineers who understood operant conditioning. It mimics the exact physical motion and psychological tension of a slot machine lever. Variable ratio schedules. In nature, if a behavior only works sometimes, the brain becomes obsessed with it. If you find fruit on a tree every single time, you eat and leave. If you only find fruit 1 out of every 10 times, your brain locks onto the tree, constantly checking it. The exploit. When you pull to refresh, you don't know if you'll get a reward, such as a like, a message, or a viral video, or if you'll get nothing. And this uncertainty triggers a release of dopamine in the ventral striatum, right? You're in this mechanistic feedback loop of trying to get positive stimulus from this pull to refresh mechanism, right? Similar with a slot machine, right? Every time you pull and lose, it triggers a tiny drip of dopamine to get you to seek out the win, which prompts you to re-engage in the behavior, right? It's a constant operant conditioning loop. You can look into B.F. Skinner. He's the one that essentially pioneered this concept. The infinite scroll, removing the stopping cues. In the analog world, reality has what we can refer to as stopping cues. You finish a chapter in a book, the article in the newspaper ends, the TV show goes to a commercial. These cues allow the prefrontal cortex to wake up and ask, is this still a good use of our time or fuel? The exploit. The infinite scroll removes every stopping cue. It creates a frictionless drip of content. The result. Because there is no natural pause, the PFC, your body's CEO, never gets the chance to make an executive decision. You stay on guard until your metabolic resources are completely spent. The synergistic lock, blue light plus dopamine. These are the two arms of infrastructural psychosis. Blue light tells the brain it is midday, suppressing melatonin and inducing wakefulness while increasing the stress hormone cortisol. Dopamine tells the brain there is a potential reward or relief nearby, facilitating engagement and habituating the use of the screen. The result? You are biologically locked to the device. Your prefrontal cortex is too tired to leave, and your amygdala is too stimulated to sleep, and so you scroll indefinitely. Sensor saturation and infrastructural psychosis. We are being subjected to the most sophisticated psychological conditioning in all of human history. In any other context, the deliberate application of chemical stressors to a population to alter their behavior would be classified as psychological warfare. By removing the stopping cues in everyday life and replacing them with hyper-stimulating variable ratio rewards in digitally mediated social environments, they have turned the primary mode of communication for most individuals, your phone or your computer, into a digital IV bag. They feed you just enough dopamine to keep you from putting the phone down, while the blue light ensures you stay awake long enough for them to sap every ounce of your attention and willpower. We are not weak, and most of us do, in fact, have someone to blame other than ourselves for our own emotions and behaviors. For many of us, we are unwitting victims of a complex form of psychosocial demoralization, where massive business enterprises have used their wealth of resources and insight into our base psychology to comprehensively map our reflexes and our vulnerabilities, and use those maps to exploit our negativity for an extra 18% profit on their bottom line. Right? So that's the end of part 1 of the treatise Infrastructural Psychosis. Right? We've gone into the biological architecture of infrastructural psychosis, the brain, how it interacts with our emotions and how we process these hormones, these neurochemical stimulus, right? How we rationalize these internal emotional states into complex frameworks and feelings and emotions, right? So, and most obviously, we focused on how social media companies and technology companies understand this and use it as a mode of being able to gain more from us, to exploit us, right? So in the next video, we're going to move on to part 2, of infrastructural psychosis, which was tentatively titled Infrastructural Psychosis, but since I've changed to The Myth of a More Connected World, Infrastructural Psychosis. So where part one was dealing in essence with the biological elements of the system, in part two we're going to actually go through the social elements of the system and how the content itself is in essence being manipulated to fracture our sense of collective reality. Right? So again, like I say, I appreciate you coming and listening to the video. If you want to support the work, you're welcome to visit the community page, comment, like, subscribe. I have a Patreon and GoFundMe. Like I said, I'm going to be releasing these as I have the time to record them until we can get through the entire treatise, with the hopes that we can expand this into a more voluminous work. Right? There are additional subjects that I can focus on as well outside of these concepts of infrastructural psychosis. We can go into the neurochemistry of addiction. We can go into habit formation. We can go into the philosophical elements of it in terms of how, we build a framework of living a good life, when we're not basically subject to political or ideological bends. There's plenty more we can explore and discover. So if you like this work, if these concepts resonate with you, feel free to continue checking back and stay tuned for more. Appreciate it. Thank you.